We're glad that all of you are here today for I Can't Believe They Did That, Anti-Harassment and Conflict Resolution Strategies. And Anna will start by introducing herself, and then I will go second, and then Anna will close us up today.
Thanks, Paula. So, as Paula said, I'm Ana Avendaño. Paula and I work together often in helping organizations in the organizing and progressive space learn to create workplaces and organizing cultures where passion and creativity thrive and bullies don't. And so today we're going to talk to you about how to handle conflicts that come up in our world all the time. And in our organizing spaces, people are really comfortable with conflict as long as the conflict is exterior. We're all about dismantling systems of oppression, challenging powerful people. But often when conflicts happen internally, we just don't know what to do. Or sometimes conflicts lead to very toxic behaviors that become very destructive of the organization. So today we're going to walk you through how do you manage conflict. I'm going to tell you our approach in a second, and we're going to sort of walk you through some tools that are available. And then Paula is going to talk about what accountability looks like in terms of holding people to their values that your organizations espouse, and using various different tools to resolve and address conflicts. If you have questions, please use the chat. During the presentation, we're going to be sharing a couple of documents. They're also in the resource section of the app, so we'll point you to that. So let's just start this issue of conflict in our spaces. Here, I've tried to capture the variety of different conflicts that Paula and I have helped to manage. I think it's really helpful not to think about conflicts as a problem to be solved, but often more as a dilemma to be managed. Conflicts are the natural result, often of people being tired, overworked, sometimes passionate, overly passionate. And so these things happen, conflicts happen a lot in our work. There are different types of conflicts, and I just, collected a few here. We've got personal conflicts, which are often some of the most difficult to deal with. We have interpersonal relationships that have either been born or brought into organizing spaces and all of a sudden break up, and that leads to conflict not just among those in the relationship, but comrades and friends around them. We've got strategic conflicts. We've got abuse. And that's a big part of what Paula's going to talk about today, too. We've got political conflicts, and then we've got Armageddon. Sometimes just things blow up and you don't actually know what the actual root of the conflict is. It's just that things start falling apart. So why is it important to understand your own conflict management style? And this is what I'm going to walk you through right now. What we have found is that we all come to the issue of conflict with a variety of experiences, approaches, personalities, you name it. And how we ourselves, how conflict shows up when we are faced with a conflict is has a lot to do with whether or not you, the person experiencing the conflict, is going to be able to resolve the conflict, exacerbate the conflict, or just not be helpful in the moment. And these are, in this slide, you'll see it's the Kilman instrument. It's a particular sort of social science research that has basically identified how people react to conflict for whatever life experience they have. So on one axis, you see a level of assertiveness or aggressiveness. And on the other axis, you see the level of collaboration. So a person who is hyper competitive is very assertive and not collaborative at all. And that kind of a person we see a lot in, especially in the labor movement, for example, and in other just organizers tend to be very sure of themselves, very comfortable with being assertive and creating conflict and not collaborative. There, if you look over on the right side, very assertive still, but also collaborative. Well, that's what you have, people who are very comfortable collaborating and are very comfortable in reaching out and bringing people together, bringing everyone around the table, and let's say, let's work through this together. As we move down the assertiveness scale, in the middle, we've got folks that are okay, so comfortable with conflict and are comfortable with collaboration to a degree. And that's the compromising approach to conflict. That's what we use in bargaining contracts. That's when you just want, it's a very transactional approach to conflict. What do you need to get? Let's just find a way to resolve this. We're in the middle. Let's just get this done. If you look on the lower side of the assertiveness scale, you see conflict avoiders. There are a lot of people who don't like conflict for whatever reason. Maybe it's the way you were brought up. Maybe it's you've had really bad experiences, either being involved in a conflict, whatever reason. What feels most comfortable when faced with a conflict, you just want to run away or avoid the conflict. And then there are those, the last sort of general way that people approach conflicts is accommodating. And those folks are not at all assertive, they're hyper collaborative. So if your style, if you're most comfortable with this accommodating style of conflict resolution, you just want everyone to get along. You want everyone to be happy. You're going to like make the couch super comfy so that everyone will just stop fighting, arguing, whatever. You just want to please everybody. Now, these are very general descriptions of folks' approach to conflict. And it really would be helpful for you to get comfortable with where do you sit on the spectrum. And that's the document that I shared, and I hope it's in your app. It just is sort of a very rough. I have a much more detailed instrument that I use with clients. But basically, it asks questions like, competitive folks are very comfortable. They are with pursuing their own goals. They absolutely believe in that their position is correct. Folks tend to be impatient with those who disagree. If that resonates with you, if that approach to conflict, then you're a competitor. Collaborative people are, like I said, really comfortable working with others. You try to satisfy various different interests. That's a pretty standard way to, it's pretty common. I talked about compromisers. You just want a fast resolution. Transactional avoiders. You can go through these and see where you sit. And one of the reasons that's important is because once you understand your own approach, all of these 5 ways to approach conflicts aren't just the way that you approach a conflict. They are also tools for managing conflicts. So if you know that you're a conflict avoider, and you actually are faced with conflicts in your work and your organizing, and you just need to develop that skill to learn how to be aggressive or assertive at the right time. And I'm going to show you what kinds of conflicts require these different tools. So that's the point that I just want to make sure that that is clear, that this chart both shows different individuals' approach to conflicts and conflict management tools. So what's your conflict management style? That's the document that I hope you have. And I can't tell whether you have it or not, so I'm just going to show you the next slide. Nobody is, we're all human, we're all complex organisms, and nobody falls into just one type of sort of conflict approach, right? What comes naturally to you on the job may be very different than what comes naturally to you with your family. Or maybe you're comfortable, as this person is, this is one of my clients, with being both very competitive and accommodating. And, remember that competition is on the highest point of the aggressiveness or assertiveness and scale, and also very low on the collaborative scale, while accommodating is the exact opposite. It's very high on the collaborating scale and zero on assertiveness. So I found this particular person to be interesting because they both of those approaches to conflict exist at the same time. And if you work through these sort of where do you sit, you'll know that you have the ability to use all of these different approaches as conflict management tools. Okay, so once you understand I'm a competitor, or I'm an accommodator, and by the way, we only have an hour and a half with you today. This process of identifying where you sit on the conflict approach scale, working through the different tools, takes much longer time. So we're just giving you the very sort of basics here, and we're happy to talk in more detail at another time. So what's next? This is the reaction that many people have, even after they understand their own conflict management style, faced with a conflict. It's just very hard to deal with still. So let's work through some of these conflict. How can these approaches to conflicts be conflict management tools? When you're faced with a conflict, and I'm talking about individual conflicts, but I'm really focusing on the conflicts that arrive in the context of organizations and groups and coalitions and organizing spaces. This isn't just sort of how do you as an individual learn to get along with your mate or spouse or friends. This is really about thinking about these issues within the organization. So these are some basic questions that you should ask yourselves or to analyze which tools might be most appropriate. So what is the level of stress in the situation that there is a conflict at the moment? If stress is very high or moderate, then it's better. It's the competing mode of conflict management, which, in other words, you just have to be really comfortable in intervening, bringing a solution. Not a lot of time for discussion. On the other hand, accommodating may also work. If there's a lot of stress, then trying to make everybody happy. So these tools are not just unidimensional. So is the problem complex, or is it unidimensional? If the problem is very simple, again, for those of you who are competitors, this is a good way to show up in the space very confident, demanding, with solutions sort of predetermined, and with that sort of raw confidence that you can get things done. If the issue is complex, you're going to have to collaborate. That is the best way, or try to move the group toward a collaborating frame. If the issue is more important to you, ask the question, is this issue important to you or to others? If it's not important to you, avoidance, or to your organization, avoidance is a really good conflict management tool. Not every conflict needs to be managed or resolved. How much time is there for discussion? If you don't have a lot of time, then collaborating may not be the answer for you, because sometimes, especially in group settings, when they adopt this collaborating approach to conflict resolution, it can go on forever. I worked with a group who was collaborating for almost 2 years and wasn't reaching any kind of resolution. That is time to interrupt that tool and say, all right, we need to think about something different. How much trust is there among the people involved in the conflict? If there is a low level of trust, maybe you should think about how do you build trust before you actually, so you would maybe avoid the conflict while you're building trust. Can people communicate their views? If yes, then great. You can move to collaboration, even to compromise. You can start negotiating this very transactional. What's the culture? Who is rewarded? That's a really important piece, because if the culture is rewarding super hyper competitive people, then it's expected that that sort of conflict management approach might need to be in the mix for others to perceive that conflict resolution as important. That's not to say that that culture shouldn't be changed, but in the moment of that conflict, recognizing what culture you're dealing with would be important. And then, how important are relationships? Are you here just to solve this particular issue and you just want to get this over, or do you want to salvage relationships? And if so, if you want to salvage relationships, then of course you have to look at the collaborative tools, accommodating, even collaborating, and figure out, how do we get there. So once you okay, so you now understand your own approach to conflict. You've sort of gone through these, and I said, all right, I need to show up even as a competitor, collaborator, whatever. Conflict resolution starts with a difficult conversation, a bold conversation, whatever you want to call it. You have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable, basically. And this is the difficult conversation. My recommendation is that you approach these conversations from the standpoint of learning. Open your mind that what you're trying to do here is understand. You're practicing empathy. So in other words, you are actually putting yourself in the other person's shoes. In sort of traditional conflict management, we learn that we have to practice active listening. And that's good. That's part of being able to have a difficult conversation, but it's just not enough. If you're practicing empathy, you are open to learning and to solutions, and you help people get to a point where they too will be able to hopefully be held accountable for their own behavior. If you're trying to intervene in some toxic behavior, if you're trying to clear up a misunderstanding, if you're approaching this difficult conversation from the point of empathy, and then moving to a learning conversation, asking a lot of why questions, practicing, like I said, active listening, where you repeat what you've heard just to confirm, not interrupting folks. Then this is like the first step to being able to then bring people together, whether it's just two individuals, whether it's your own conflict, or in a group setting. It starts with a difficult conversation. Now, I have a sheet that I forgot to share, but happy to share it later, of what are the steps to having a difficult conversation, and what should you just remember, is that don't walk into a difficult conversation thinking that you have the answer. You may have the answer, but you may not. And you have to remain open to learning from whatever conversation you're having. Practicing empathy does not mean that you are enabling abuse. It means that you are there to listen, to understand where the other person is coming from, in order to absorb that knowledge and be able to shape your own response, or to offer, like, how do we move forward? The difficult conversation is not just one difficult conversation that's going to last an hour. Depending on the conflict, especially if the conflict involves people who are in relationship, whether it's professional relationship or personal relationship, the difficult conversation may take several steps, because hurt feelings are really important. They're real in all of our spaces, and people often, because of patriarchy, we don't like to admit that my feelings were hurt, and I'm really angry not just because of your behavior, but I am hurt or I am jealous. All of these feelings that are natural human reactions that are not, often allowed to sort of surface in these professional organizing spaces that were often expected to be either superhuman or super tough, or, you pick your cliche. And so practicing empathy helps you break through some of those, cultural norms that we're brought up with. And then the conversation has to continue. Like I said, the more complicated, the more complex the conflict, the more difficult conversations you'll have to have. And this is a practice. It is not a training whether you're going to do it once and here's the tools, just go do it. You have to practice this all the time. It does get easier because you will get more comfortable operating from the standpoint of just practicing empathy. And that's not easy to do, because I often hear, or I'm very empathetic. And if someone shares a problem with me, I immediately tell them, like, well, if I were you, I would do this. That is not empathy. Empathy is listening, opening yourself up to try to understand where the other person is coming from, walking in their shoes. Like I said, it's hard because sometimes you'll feel like you may be enabling harassment. You're not. You are just really trying to understand that. So I don't want to be repetitive, but I just want to emphasize that empathy, that this idea of approaching difficult situations from a place of openness and vulnerability may seem like a contradiction, but I think that's basically the secret sauce. I'm going to just talk a little bit about restorative justice, then I'll hand it over to you, Paula. So in the work that Paula and I do, we handle grievances for political organization that involve harassment, sexual harassment, race harassment, or other kinds of toxic conduct. And in processing these grievances, we often are asked to, well, why can't can we just have restorative justice here? I'm a trained restorative justice facilitator. I am an ardent believer in restorative justice, but I have also seen restorative justice really used in the wrong way, and they're in a very harmful way. So restorative justice is an approach to healing collective harm. It is not a silver bullet. It is not available to perpetrators of harm who are not able to acknowledge the harm they've caused, and is also not a substitute for fact finding. And I think I'm going to change the wording of this because that sounds a little overly legalistic. But I'll give you an example of situations that we have faced in the past is when we're processing a complaint that someone has sexually harassed another member of this organization, the perpetrator shows up and says to me, and this is true, I have assembled a restorative justice team. I'm ready to go. And when I asked, well, what does the survivor want this? What harm did you cause? If the perpetrator or the person is not able to answer that question, acknowledge harm, recognize harm, then restorative justice will not work, is not available in that situation. The really hard thing to do is to work with people to understand that accountability is not punishment. We have been brought up in this carceral state. I mean, our legal system is all about incentivizing people who have caused harm to stay silent, because you don't want to acknowledge that you've done something. If you do, you're either going to get fined, go to jail, lose your job, you name it. Some punishment comes from accepting that you have harmed another human being. So restorative justice is really changes that, flips that paradigm. And so what we're talking about is recognizing that harm happens, that people who are harmed may be harm doers at the same time, that human beings are much more complex, have the capacity to grow and acknowledge bad behavior, learn from it, and then not be harmful in the future. Many in our work, we hear from survivors of racial harassment or sexual harassment all the time. I don't want the person punished. I just want the harassment to stop. The restorative practices are one way to get that, an early intervention that helps people grow, helps people be accountable. But like I said, we wanted to just raise this with you because we've seen it too often sort of thought of as the silver bullet, or, oh, I just want restorative justice. You can't ask for restorative justice until we've identified the harm, we've brought the community, that the survivor of that harm uh, wants to be there to support them, then the process of restorative justice can begin. So that's it for me. I will hand it over to you, Paula. Do you want me to, and you just tell me when to click the slides.
Okay, thanks, Anna. I'm Paula Brantner. My consulting firm is PB Work Solutions, and for a little over 5 years, my work has been focused on dealing with harassment and toxic workplace prevention. And I found pretty quickly that often where things fall apart are around reporting and investigation systems, and the lack of any process made it just impossible to resolve disputes and conflict. And so I've been involved for the last several years as the National Harassment Grievance Officer for DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, and also worked with other organizations on what is the process that you have in place so that there is a beginning and an end, and there can be accountability and moving forward from conflict in a way that does not destroy the good work that people are doing. So I'm going to start with a few basic assumptions and then go into a little more detail. And the first assumption is we can transform cancel culture by creating accountability culture. Next slide. One thing that I've learned in my work, and Anna as well, we've talked many times about the legal system and how it is a punitive carceral determination. You win, you lose. There's a plaintiff and a defendant. And the point of going through the legal system is to resolve it with a winner and a loser. And despite nearly 3 decades as an attorney, I firmly believe that in successfully addressing these kinds of conflicts, that a binary determination based on the legal system is destined to fail. Next.
Oops.
The third assumption is that you cannot resolve conflict without a route to accountability. I've found many, many times that once conflict has arisen, you need a way forward, you need a way out. And otherwise, you will always remain mired in conflict. You will never have any closure, and it will be impossible for the other person to be held accountable for that conduct. And so, what we've tried to do in our work is create that pathway, create that route to accountability. And I'll talk more about what that looks like. Next. Determining accountability first can provide a framework for resolving the conflict. And that ties back to what Anna just said. You can't skip ahead and not have any framework for resolving the conflict without first determining accountability. And so I'll talk about how that works in the context of a process. Next slide, please. So, I'd like to start a little bit by talking about what is cancel culture in progressive spaces. And of course, we hear a lot about cancel culture these days. And if you weren't a progressive person and just see what's happening on the internet, you might think that it's all coming from the conservative right. That basically anyone who tries to object to anything that is said or done is trying to cancel someone. And, we see this in conversations about particular individuals that are known to have caused harm. We see it, we even saw it a few months back involving the Kentucky Derby and a horse that was found to have been violated the doping policy, had too much of a non allowed substance in their system. So, apparently, according to the right, even horses can be canceled. But that's not what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what it looks like on the left. Next slide, please. I just ran across this wonderful interview with Adrienne Marie Brown, and it's in Yes Magazine. And the article is called On Harm and Accountability. And she says, oh, it's like a cancellation wave. Something is happening where it suddenly feels like the only way we know how to interact with each other is to call for the disposal of each other. This feels like something other than boundaries. It feels like the joyful destruction of each other. And we see this happening in amongst very good people in very good organizations, people tearing each other apart that were formerly allies and comrades. And so, how can we move past this joyful destruction of each other? Next. Some of the ways that it can show up in progressive spaces is the person coming forward to report the harm. Is it the survivor? Or is it a person with direct knowledge of the situation that is acting upon authority of the survivor? Or is it based on hearsay and rumor? Is it the person driving the public discourse, not the person harmed at all? It may not even be acting with their consent or with full knowledge of the situation. The harm that is said to have been caused may be just a matter of opinion. Again, not coming directly from the person who was harmed, but not really well defined. Just it's bad, it's harmful. And so, we have to be able to define what harm has been caused by the behavior. We see a lot of what's I call trial by Twitter. Uh, a dispute, a conflict plays out on social media. It's not the same as if it were playing out in the press, where journalistic standards apply and there's efforts to verify the information on both sides. And there's concern about defamation. So, journalists don't come forward unless there's some ability to verify what happened. All bets are off on Twitter and other social media. And people can and do say whatever they want about a particular situation. Next slide. We see often this, trial by Twitter and public airing of conflict as the first resort rather than the last resort. Rather than trying anything to solve the conflict, whether it's going through some kind of process or even having that difficult conversation that Anna referenced, it's just go immediately online and blow someone up. That joyful destruction. And a lot of times you see it's an effort to name someone as a bad person rather than someone who is engaged in bad conduct. And so, it becomes very personal, it becomes very polarized and very adversarial because to accept that you engaged in this conduct is to accept the frame that you're a terrible person and only terrible people engage in this conduct. So, those are some of the things that we see. If there is a process, it's not just that there's no due process, but sometimes there's not any process. Someone is just declared permanently canceled, banned for life. There's been no effort to go through anything to verify the facts of what happened, listen to any explanation, or verify any of the veracity of the people involved. Next. And so there are ways that the cancel culture causes additional harm that amplify the original harm that's being discussed. And one thing that we see happen very frequently when someone accuses another person of some kind of wrongful behavior, what we see is what is called Darvo. And there's a pattern that is very common when someone is accused of something. If their response is to deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, that is the staple of crisis communications. That's what people are told to do when they have been accused of harassment, when they've been accused of assault or criminal behavior or any kind of wrongdoing. They go on the offensive and do these Darvo techniques of denying, attacking, reversing the victim and offender. They're the victim. They're the person harmed, not the person who come forward to tell their story and to ask for some redress for the harm that they suffered. It's not a survivor-centered process, in that often when these things spiral out in public and with all of these other people involved, the survivor often loses control of any kind of information being shared, private personal details about their interactions with the accused become public knowledge. The situations that Anna described earlier, where someone may just want an apology, may just want to have a conversation, they often lose control of their ability to determine how they want to resolve the harm when things escalate publicly. And then other people see this, and maybe they've been harmed too, or they've been harmed by the same person, and they see the free for all, that professionally technical term called a shit show. And that discourages other people from coming forward and sharing what they experienced. And they want no part of this. They just back away. They leave the organization. They leave the space, and they may not ever have a pathway towards accountability or addressing the harm. It often creates a binary legal adversarial process where, when you've been accused publicly of something like this, it makes it impossible to back down. You have to win. You have to prevail. You have to show that, you're not this bad person. And it makes it really difficult to admit fault. And say that, in the situation you did anything wrong, or, in retrospect, you would handle it differently. It's like, no, you have to win, and you have to make sure the other side loses. And often with the way these things play out, being engaged in this conflict that is escalated in this way can follow you for the rest of your life. It becomes part of your record on Google, on social media, in other forms of kind of recorded documents and history. And it can lead to people leaving their profession or the organizations that they passionately care about and have been involved in nurturing and building, and even community. People have had to move to get away from the level of public discourse without any kind of end towards accountability and resolving the conflict. Next slide, please. One person who's been very influential in my thinking on the subject, and if you want to learn more about this part of it, is Loretta J. Ross. And she has a TED Talk called What If Instead of Calling People Out, We Called Them In? And she talks a lot about how to uh, address behavior that needs to be recognized and hold people accountable, but ways to do it with love and not giving in to some of these toxic aspects of conflict resolution that we see in cancel culture. And she has both a TED Talk and has also, she's a professor at Smith College and has taught a course on this. And she has been adapting that Smith College course so that other people can take it. And I took it last year. She called it White Supremacy in the Age of Trump. And I understand that she's now in the process of reformulating that course now that Trump is no longer in office. But I would highly recommend you going to her website, signing up for her mailing list, and looking at some of the things that she has done and written, because I think it's she's been someone part of this movement for a very long time, and she's seen the things that we talk about, and has a very insightful perspective on this. Next. So now I want to talk about some of the strategies that we can use in our spaces, in our organizations, in our workplaces, to create an effective accountability program. Next slide. This has 6 aspects, and I'm going to go through the various components one at a time. And the first component is policies. What is the harm that is sought to be protected against? And certainly with harassment, there's a whole body of federal, state, and local law defining what is, sexual harassment, racial harassment, other kinds of harassment. One of the issues that we've encountered is that this harassment policies are very focused on individual characteristics, or what we know in the law as protected classes. And this is things like sex or gender, race, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, these individual characteristics that define us. And so, we found in a number of situations that when harmful conduct occurs, we may not be able to get at it or address it if we just stick to the legal definitions, because the law protects certain people and particular types of harm, and doesn't protect certain people and particular types of harm. So it's really important when you have a policy to not just do the boilerplate legal policy that you cut and paste from like an EEO statement, but you need to go beyond the law. The first thing is to identify any individuals that are part of your community and your spaces who are at a particularly high risk of being targeted for harassment. And this has changed pretty dramatically over the last couple of years. The Supreme Court decision in Bostock, which said that sexual orientation and gender identity are part of are forms of sex harassment, gender harassment, or sex discrimination and gender discrimination. Before that, we did not have a federal law defining sexual orientation and gender identity discrimination as being against the law. We did have a number of states that covered that. We did have a number of local ordinances that covered that. And even now, with the Bostock decision, we still have efforts, including a bill called the Equality Act, which would still fill all the gaps, because the Bostock Supreme Court decision was focused on employment. And there are other instances, of course, we know healthcare, we know public accommodations. There are a number of other instances where there's not a specific protection. And so if you're working with any group, you should identify who is in the policy and who is left out of the policy. And if the people left out of the policy are at a high risk of being targeted, you want to add them as well. Who is the target population of your work? If you work with unhoused people, then discriminating and harassing someone because they are unhoused obviously would be something that you would want to include. So identify to make sure that who your clients are, your communities, your stakeholders are all included. Under the law, often independent contractors and vendors are not included, and that's something we see in political spaces, that there's a lot of interaction with those outside folks. And again, they're not typically subject to legal protections, but they still should be part of your policy if they are part of your space. In the nonprofit world, we see situations with donors and funders. People who give money to your organization and think that that entitles them to special treatment, which can go up to harassment and assault. Volunteers. Nonprofit and community organizations, political organizations have a lot of people who are not employees, but are part of the space and need to be covered, both themselves protected as volunteers and what to do if a volunteer harasses someone else in the space. So it's very important to define all the forms of harassment and inappropriate behavior that you want to prevent, and define all of the individual communities who would be subject to that policy. Next slide, please. If you want to go beyond nuts and bolts on this, after you have your harassment policy in place, it's also very important to have a code of conduct. And Anna and I work together on a number of codes of conduct for organizations. But you can go beyond the law and beyond the specific harassment policies with codes of conduct that affirmatively express the values of the organization. You can focus on the conduct itself and not just the individual characteristics of the person. You can expand it beyond to online conduct, to meeting conduct, to offsite conduct. It's not just limited to the four walls of the workplace, which you often see in harassment policies. And what they represent is that bullying and toxic behavior don't belong in a professional environment and don't belong in your spaces. And so it's really useful to have a code of conduct that works in conjunction with your harassment policy to make sure all the kinds of conduct are covered and there are ways to address it if it happens. Next slide. The second component is training. We're obviously doing some training right here. You are probably familiar with anti-harassment training in your workplace. It's typically not specifically required under federal law, but a number of states and some local jurisdictions require it. But one thing about training requirements is often it's something that is presented by the employer as a way to avoid legal liability. And it often covers just the bare minimum that the employer has to share in order to be in compliance with what the law requires. And again, very focused on liability and, covering their ass and not prevention of harassment. And so, if you want to go beyond the bare minimum, you need to do training, not just once and forget about it, check off that box and never worried about it again. It should happen with onboarding. When new people, employees, or individuals joining the space come on board, it should be conducted at least annually. There are a lot of developments, and it's just important to keep updating what you include in your training, and it really should be customized for a specific space, a specific organization. And one thing we've seen over the last couple of years is that there's this assumption that because of COVID, we're not interacting physically as much. And so we don't need to do this training because we're not in spaces where, people can touch and grope each other or say inappropriate things face to face. But we have found during COVID that harassment and bullying and other toxic behavior is still happening. And so it's still very important, even if you have to do it virtually, to continue with your training protocols. Next slide, please. Some other things that you can do personally. Maybe you're the person that's not in charge of training, and it's all dependent on your employer or the leader of the organization, and you don't have any ability to affect what training is done. There are things that you can do to help, called bystander intervention techniques. And there are whole trainings on bystander intervention, and I encourage you to take one if you have the opportunity. But just some ways that you can quickly intervene if need be. Start by knowing who the bad actors are. We talk about the whisper network and people who are known for their patterns of behavior. So sometimes if you see someone talking to someone else who has been part of that whisper network, and whose behavior may have been problematic in the past, there are ways for you to intervene and deflect that. It's helpful to know what to say. If someone says something inappropriate or offensive, how do you catch that in the moment? And some people kind of freeze. It's a challenge to know the right thing to say, but you can bet this is going to happen to you at some point. And, going back to your approach in dealing with conflict that Anna was talking about, it's like, can you deflect with humor? Do you want to call it out in a particular way? Do you have some kind of catchphrase that you want to say? And practice in advance saying that. So the next time you hear something appropriate, it is just second nature for you to blurt out your response, like, I cannot believe you just said that, or can you repeat that for me? Just any way to call attention to, something that was said or done that can put the spotlight on it. If you are the target or you are witnessing someone being harassed or abused, know what to record. Document, document, document. Jot it down. Record on your phone. Do something that is a contemporaneous notation of what happened. And nothing may ever come of it, but at least write it down, so if things happen again, you can see that there's a pattern of conduct. And then you should know what to do next. Some supervisors have, required reporting. They are mandatory reporters. But even if you're not a supervisor, be aware of what the reporting options are in your space. I'm going to talk more about those soon, but and if it's not happening to you, one way that you may be helpful to the person that is being targeted is to share, like, is this something you would like to report? Would you like me to tell someone? Show that you can be an ally and be supportive if it's not personally happening to you. One thing we're also starting to see in terms of training developments is peer-to-peer training. That it's not someone from HR coming in. It's not, professionals who do this work like Anna and myself. It's someone in the particular space who's familiar with the kinds of harmful conduct that may be happening. Perhaps they speak the same language as their other coworkers in the space, and so we're really eager to see how much that is going to make a difference with a peer presenting the information as opposed to a leader or an HR professional. Next slide, please. In terms of reporting, how do you report harassment? While it is not required to have a particular reporting mechanism under federal law, there may be something required under state and local law, and it is definitely a factor in legal liability. And so a number of employers have set up reporting systems because of, to prevent lawsuits and to satisfy legal obligations. But we're also starting to see a lot of reporting systems in organizations, in umbrella groups like professional societies, membership associations, where it's not just an individual workplace, but a larger collective form of reporting. And this is something I'm particularly interested in my work because it's where the process typically breaks down. We've seen for several decades people have policies, people have trainings, but where it falls apart is the reporting piece. And often people haven't set anything up, and then they learn about some kind of harm having been caused, and they have a situation on their hands, and they don't have the processes and systems for people to report to be able to determine the extent of the problem. Next slide. So, how to do it right. It's important in terms of reporting to have multiple points of contact. Someone might not be comfortable with a particular channel, and someone in that channel may very well be part of the problem, maybe the harasser. And so, in a workplace situation, you want to have senior managers, your supervisor, and HR if you have it. You also want to have multiple approaches to reporting. Is there a way for someone to report something confidential or anonymously? Is there a way to report something verbally and know they'll take action, and not just a formal written complaint where, knowing about something verbally is an excuse not to do anything? So you need to have multiple ways to recognize when a report has been made and not require any kind of official report to take action if the person who has been harmed wants something to be done about the harm. Next slide. There has been a rise in third-party reporting where you can report outside the organization to an external reporter. And there have been a number of apps and web apps that have been created. A number of companies have developed whistleblower or ethics hotlines. And the idea is those are not directly affiliated with the company or an outside law firm. And I work with a company called All Voices, and the image here is what their reporting system looks like. So you may want to, instead of having the report go to HR or to senior leadership, with the concerns that people won't feel safe reporting or that it will just be buried or denied, you may want to enlist some kind of third-party reporting. And I'm happy to talk with anyone who's interested in that more about how that would work. Next slide, please. So the next step is, how do you investigate the report? You've learned about something bad that has happened. You have a report in front of you. What happens now? A number of companies have HR, internal individuals who can investigate. But the question again, are they well trained? And there are trainings that you can go to learn about how to conduct investigations. And I went through one earlier this year. I have a credential from the Association of Workplace Investigators. And there are other ways that you can get training for how to investigate in an objective manner, a neutral manner, and where you can focus on getting at what happened, not just learning just enough to protect the company from liability. And I find this is where things really can fall apart in these internal investigations if there's not some effort to make sure that somebody who reports can be trusted, and that they're not just farmed out to a law firm that is focused on protecting the employer from liability, but is actually, designed to figure out what happened and take appropriate action. Next slide, please. Um, and in light of what I just said, and some of the problems with internal investigations, people are turning to third-party independent investigators, and that's something that Anna and I have both done. And there are people out there that do that who are not affiliated with the company or with the outside law firm and focused on defending the company, who have received specific training in workplace investigations, and very importantly, have received trauma informed training so that they understand what is happening when someone who has been harassed or assaulted is reporting. And having an outside investigator can also ensure that the company's prevention program is placed under scrutiny. And as I mentioned, the Association of Workplace Investigators do that, but there are also others. I'm happy to talk more about that to anyone who's interested. Next slide, please. The next component is, how do we have accountability through remedies for the harm? When you go through this whole process, you find a violation of the policy, it's reported, you investigate it, and you find that the policy is violated. What happens now? It is very important at that moment to take immediate and proportionate corrective action. And the corrective action that you take should not create an additional burden on the person who is harmed. So if you say, okay, these two people should not work in the same office, well, it's the person who is the harasser, who has violated the policy, that should have to move to a different office, not the person who reported it. So you always want to make sure that any resolution doesn't create some additional harm or disadvantage the person for reporting. You also need to monitor any solution you devise for retaliation. Retaliation is very common when someone comes forward and reports. I think there was one of the Time's Up reports that said 70% of the people who reported harassment or misconduct experienced retaliation. So, is incumbent upon the employer, the organization, whoever is in charge of the process, to make sure that retaliation doesn't happen. What kind of remedies you have can vary with the severity of the violation and what disciplinary authority that they have. Obviously, a workplace, there's specific laws, and you can terminate someone's employment. There's a whole criminal legal process for that kind of conduct. But there are also things like membership organizations are saying, hey, we can kick you out of the organization. This is a voluntary organization, and we have certain standards we expect for our members, and you are not found to have met those standards. And so we can do a suspension or an expulsion. So, some of the various remedies certainly can vary with the conduct, but also what authority the investigating body has over the wrongdoer. Next slide, please. When you have a process that you've seen through to the end and want to have accountability, you have to think who knows what about the conclusion of the process. And transparency is key. There have been workplace situations where someone reported in their workplace and they go through the whole process, and even though you're the person who reported, you can't find out what happened because it's a personnel matter. And so the survivor is not even included in communication about the outcome. And so it's very important to ensure that there is some sort of transparency around the process. And if you want to see how this plays out in culture here today, compare the investigation of Andrew Cuomo with a 164 page report about his conduct with 11 individuals. Now, compare that to the Washington football team, where the NFL has conducted investigation and fined the owner of the Washington football team, Dan Snyder, $10 million, but they have not released anything about the report. And that report included allegations that WFT cheerleaders were had photographs of them topless taken and disseminated without their knowledge, and a number of forms of harassment within the organization. But we don't know what happened. We don't know the outcome of the investigation. So it's really important to have a transparent outcome. It can be challenging in employment setting because you are subject to some legal parameters and personnel guidelines, but especially in organizations that are not subject to those legal requirements, think about how you can demonstrate both to the reporting party, the accused party who has violated the policy, and everyone else that you have a process, you take it seriously, and this is the outcome and what will happen if this conduct is reported. Next slide, please. Who knows about it? There is a wrong way to handle this, and the answer is not to require at the end of the process, or even if it's brought up in a legal setting, a non-disclosure agreement. And those have just systematically taken place over time as a way to settle harassment lawsuits, and they have protected abusive individuals over and over and over again, and prevented survivors from finding out that particular individuals were causing harm, and they had caused harm to other people. And so there have been a number of efforts, both kind of organizing efforts and efforts to change the law, which prevent the use of non-disclosure agreements. Similarly, some instead, in lieu of the court system, some employers have tried to require people to arbitrate their claims in a secret tribunal. And again, that is not transparency, that is not accountability. And what we've seen that happens is if you go through a whole process and there's no transparency at the end, that puts us right back in cancel culture, because the only way for anyone to know what happened is for it to blow up in public online, with people outside the situation involved. And so if we really want to have accountability, there cannot be transparency about the outcome. Or there must be transparency about the outcome, I mean. Next slide, please. The final component is institutional accountability. And as Anna referenced earlier, sometimes we make it hard for people to acknowledge fault, to rectify the harm that they've caused, and their lawyers may be telling them not to say anything that would admit to any particular kind of conduct. But we found that talk is cheap, but proactive prevention is not. And organizations have to allocate time and money to building these systems that are transparent and do hold people accountable. And if you don't have that accountability and transparency at the top of the organization, you won't find it elsewhere in the organization. Next slide, please. So the three prongs that we see of institutional accountability is it something that is proactively funded? Is it built into the annual budget? Is there an effort to continue building every year to provide a better process and fix problems that have come before? Or is it just oh no, we have a claim, we have an emergency, we have to throw some money at this, we have to call the lawyers, and people panicking over what dealing with this is going to cost? I'm dating myself, but there's the old Midas commercial. You can pay me now or you can pay me later. And so we really need proactive prevention strategies and accountability strategies rather than just responding after something happens. Is there time allotted to make it a priority? Is it just kind of a toss away at the end of some other, retreat or process after you're just tired and it's one more thing to listen to? Or is adequate time built in to do trainings, to review policies, to make decisions? And if someone in the organization is responsible for it, is it part of their job description rather than something else thrown on their desk when something happens? You've got to build it into the systems that you have. And then how are members of the leadership held accountable? Are you required to sue for senior leaders to be accountable in any way? Can you go through all these processes and at the end say, well, yeah, you found that something bad happened, something wrong happened, policies were violated, laws were broken, but you're going to have to sue me? That's not the process we want to see. And so some thought needs to be given in advance how leadership will hold themselves accountable to their processes, and whether public disclosures, public statements, or some kind of restorative justice process like what Anna was talking about would be an appropriate way to address the situation when accountability is required. Next slide, please. So I'm going to leave you with three important principles. The first is that no one of these six components will be successful in isolation. All six are essential. And, I get calls, I'm sure Anna gets calls of, will you do a training for me? And I've made it a policy. I won't do just a training when I have no ability to look at the policies, look at the systems, and make sure that they all work together towards prevention and accountability. You can't just take one piece of them. You can't just cut and paste a policy that another organization is using. You've got to think about all of these various aspects and make sure they all work in tandem. Next slide. When you do this, when you build this accountability system, you will find that initially, when it's available for the first time and shared with people in your space, that a lot of old issues will surface because there wasn't a way to address or deal with it before. And so a bunch of people will come forward, and you may not have been aware of the extent of the problem. You can say, well, no one's ever reported anything, so that must mean we don't have a problem. That's not the case. When people come forward, you will often get a lot of old issues surfacing. You will also create an expectation that new issues surfacing, now that there's a process in place, will be dealt with promptly. That it won't take years to resolve something now that you have a process in place. And so new standards and an effort to uh, you know change the culture means that your numbers of things that people report will go up before they go down. And you should not be alarmed by that. That's a feature, not a bug. And so just expect whenever you put something like this in place, don't freak out when you get a lot of reports at the beginning, because you've got all the kind of pent up demand, and then you've got new things that people expect to be dealt with. Next slide, please. And finally, it's a journey, not a destination. Putting all of these techniques into practice, they may never end conflict. I think it's something that will always be among us, and something that you just have to be prepared to deal with. And we've tried to give you some techniques to dealing with that conflict. But one thing that you can expect is putting these processes into place can reduce the harm and disruption to your work, your organization, your employment, and create a pathway towards moving forward in a positive fashion, rather than continually remaining mired in conflict. Next slide, please. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. Invite you to either connect with me on LinkedIn, or shoot me an email, or sign up for my newsletter. I don't post very often. I swear you won't get a lot of emails when you do that. And I'm happy. I know sometimes there are things we talk about that aren't really appropriate to ask questions and discuss individually here. So I want to make it clear that I'm available afterwards, and would welcome hearing from any of you about any of the things that we've talked about today. And I can also forward things to Anna as well. As she mentioned, we do work very closely together in a lot of different things, so happy to do that. So I guess at this point we will open it up for questions, and we've got about 8 minutes left on time. So let's go from here. Okay, I've looked through the chat, and most of the things are from the day at Netroots Nation that we weren't able to present, and some people wondering where we were. So if there are some new questions, we would love to address those. Or if everyone feels things are covered, we can wrap up the session. And Carolyn reminds us that you should go into the app and rate the session as well. We definitely would appreciate your feedback there. Is there anyone who wants to ask any questions? Okay, well, the Netroots Nation folks told us that, if we didn't have any questions at the end, or weren't going until the end, that we could go ahead and wrap up. Anna, do you have any parting words or anything that you want to include?
No, just thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming. And again, pbworksolutions@gmail.com if you have any further questions or follow-up or feedback. Thanks so much.